But this week, the Biden administration released the names of 10 prescription drugs that Medicare would begin negotiating prices for with those drug manufacturers. And joining me to talk about the drugs in question and how this is all going to work is Washington correspondent for StatNews, Rachel Kohrs. Rachel, thank you for coming on the DC Debrief. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And it's a very interesting situation here because it feels to me like there's two sides to this, and both sides kind of have to agree to kind of go along with this. But before we get into how this is all going to work, can you run down the 10 medications that we're talking about? What 10 medications will Medicare start negotiating for?
Yes. So the list, just to run down quickly, as you said, Medicare chose 10 medications that are going to be kind of the guinea pigs in its first round of negotiations. And that list includes Eliquis, which is a blood thinner, Jardiance, which is a diabetes drug, Xarelto, which is a blood thinner as well, Januvia, a diabetes drug. There's an AstraZeneca diabetes drug, Farxiga, Novartis' heart failure treatment, Entresto, Amgen's rheumatoid arthritis drug, Enbrel. And then there's also a blood cancer treatment called Imbruvica. There's an anti-inflammatory drug used to treat Crohn's disease called Stelara. Mm-hmm. And there's a group of Novo Nordisk insulins called like Novolog or Fiasp.
Now, some people listening won't know what some of those drugs are, but I would imagine there are a number of people listening to the podcast and watching here on YouTube that maybe take at least one of those drugs, if not multiples of those different drugs. And Medicare is the largest single purchaser of prescription drugs in the country. Prescriptions are the program's fastest growing expense, and Medicare accounts for about 20% of all medical spending in the U.S., and about 1/3 of all that spending is on prescriptions. So it makes sense that the Biden administration would want to try and tackle this. Why were these specific medications chosen?
So these specific drugs were chosen because they cost the Medicare program the most money. So some of them, they kind of fall into two categories. Some of them are really expensive medications, like Imbruvica. It's a blood cancer drug. It costs a lot of money for patients that take it. So even if only a few patients take it, it costs the Medicare program a whole lot. Other drugs, like some of these blood thinners, they're a little cheaper, month to month of a cost for patients, but they're just so widely used that, the sheer volume of patients that are taking these medications kind of bumped that up on the list of which drugs cost Medicare the most.
So part of any negotiation requires both sides needing to be willing to sit down and negotiate. And the fact that there is already some lawsuits in the works filed against Medicare drug price negotiations, I guess the question that comes out of that is how likely are these companies to sit down and negotiate with Medicare to get these drug prices lowered?
So the drug companies would tell you that this isn't really a negotiation in the way that you think of it, where two sides sit down across the table from each other and talk. And I think that's what they're arguing in their lawsuits. And essentially, the only way for drug makers to get out of these negotiations is for them to leave the Medicare program entirely, which, as you said, is the biggest purchaser. That's a big problem for the business propositions for a lot of these drugs. And I guess there's an alternative that the drug makers don't like to talk about, where they could allow generic competition on the market, even if they've created these complex legal webs to protect the medications. A lot of times they have these settlements with generic drug makers who might be trying to put competitors on the market at a lower price. And so there's an incentive now for these brand drug manufacturers to potentially allow some of these competitors on the market earlier.
So what you're saying is these companies could refuse, but then they would be losing out on this massive pool of people who need these medications and this massive influx of cash. Even if the prices are lowered, it would still be a tremendous loss of business.
Right. It's true. And Congress, when they passed this bill, this law, they didn't expect any like drug maker to actually pull their drugs off of the market. And if they keep their drug in Medicare, then they face really expensive fines for that'll take cuts out of their profits for these medications. So I think that drug makers are arguing that they're being, coerced into this negotiation program. But the government is arguing that there's no constitutional right for a drug maker to sell drugs in Medicare. and that the program should be allowed to use its leverage and bargaining power with all the people it's negotiating on behalf of to get a better price.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess Medicare, it's a government program, but at the same time, it's its own thing. It's acting as, I guess, a business in this case, and so the legal straddling of those lines, you can kind of see where the lines don't exactly meet up there.
It's true, but I think there's also a good point that the government has tried to make, and that other government agencies negotiate like this for prices already. I think the Veterans Affairs Administration does this, the DoD, the Department of Defense does this too. So it's not unheard of for a government agency to use their authority in this way.
Sure, the Defense Department negotiates contracts all the time, as we well know. So when we're talking about the folks listening to this podcast, I mean, how much money could this save people?
So that's a good question. I think in order for us to know how much this program is going to save people, we have to know what the prices are, which we don't have the answers to quite yet. But I think it's likely that consumers are going to see some savings if you're taking these drugs. And the important factor is how your insurance plan is structured. Because in Medicare's pharmacy benefit, there are a lot of different options for what people can choose for their plan to look like. And the people who are going to see the most cost savings here are the ones that are paying based on a percentage of a drug's price, which is actually pretty common in the Medicare Part D program. And so if they're paying a percentage of a drug's price, now, after these prices go into effect in 2026, they're going to be paying a percentage of a much lower price. So there's a potential for savings there at the pharmacy counter for sure. Another important thing to note is that this law also capped Medicare beneficiaries' out-of-pocket costs in this category at $2,000 a year starting in 2025. So for a lot of these really expensive medications, they may be hitting the cap already. So, it's unclear. Each of these drugs is going to be their own kind of case study and how this works out for patients. But it is reasonable to expect that there could be some cost savings at the pharmacy counter.
And these savings, when are they expected to go into effect?
So these prices that are going to be kind of the first round will go into effect in 2026.
So it's going to be a little while before people start to see savings on this, at least a couple of years. And are they going to be adding more drugs? I think there's a plan for more drugs to get added onto these lists in subsequent years, right?
Yes, there are. They're starting with 10 because this is a brand new thing for Medicare to be doing. So they had to they had to hire a bunch of people, create this new agency to help run this program that is, very highly contested. So they're starting out with 10 drugs this year. They're going to increase that number to 15 drugs the next year. They'll have another 15 drugs the year after that. And then it'll be 20 drugs a year into perpetuity. And note that it's additive. We start with 10. And then next year, it's another 15. So then there's 25 total in this program. So it will definitely grow in influence and in savings to the Medicare program as it goes on.
I did see one piece of criticism, or I guess maybe just a cautionary warning from former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, who was on CNBC when this first came out. And it should be noted that he is also serving on the board of Pfizer and Illumina. So, I mean, everybody has an interest in some of these things one way or the other if you're in the field. But he said that there were unintended consequences here, and most notably that pharmaceutical companies will start to do less in terms of trying to create what are called smaller molecule medicines, which are just like the pills that we take that are used to treat these different things, and invest more in the biologics, the ones that require an IV or injections, because those larger molecule medications are not subject to these price adjustments. Am I getting that right?
I think it's important to note that the timeline is just a little longer. The biologics just get a little bit longer on the market before they're subjected to these mandatory discounts. So what I would say is that is a very common talking point with the pharmaceutical industry. And what I would say, first of all, is that this isn't the first policy that Congress has passed that creates this disparity in small molecule drugs being treated differently than biologics. I think FDA's exclusivity periods already give biologics more protection, which in general, the pharmaceutical industry supported at the time because they argued that biologics are more complicated, they're harder to develop, they're more expensive, so they should get more time on the market. But now the industry has changed its tune and is arguing that it's unfair. And I will say that patent protection is currently the same for both of these types of medications. So I've talked to CEOs. They have acknowledged that this is not the only place where this incentive exists, but they argue that it does make the incentive much more powerful and meaningful because there's a determined outcome. There's no question of whether a generic competitor might come on the market. There's no option. Medicare is going to negotiate for these lower prices, and there's a lot more certainty in that outcome.
Well, this is one of those issues, one of those topics that does affect ordinary Americans. I try to focus on these issues here on the podcast. And Rachel Kohrs does fantastic work for StatNews. She's the Washington correspondent. And I would encourage everyone to check out their policy newsletter. It's called DC Diagnosis. If they want to learn more about your work and get the newsletter, how do they go about doing that, Rachel?
So I'd recommend visiting our website at statnews.com. I have colleagues that do incredible work on covering science, covering business, covering drug development, healthcare. We cover it all. And that's a great place to start. And you can sign up for our newsletter, and we have others as well.
Rachel Kohrs from StatNews, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.